Hello and welcome. In this video, I thought we would cover the last two remaining armies that we haven't covered yet for the Ark of Omens that were already covered on this channel. These two armies are rather brief in nature, so it's going to be pretty quick to cover both of them as they haven't experienced an excessive amount of changes, but they did see some important changes nonetheless. So let's dive right into the changes, beginning with the Sisters of Battle, also known as the Adepta Sororitas. The first rule change we'll have to address is the universal changes to the Armor of Contempt. Being that Armor of Contempt has now been removed and is no longer part of the game, so the Sisters of Battle definitely become a little weaker, and you have to remember the changes to the Order of the Valorous Heart are also reversed due to this change. In either case, I don't think it's the end of the world for the Sisters of Battle, as they were never particularly a very tanky army and relied more on being more of a glass cannon by being able to engage and cause massive damage before being destroyed on their own end. However, that being said, there are some units that suffer more than others as a result of these changes, and we'll kind of talk about those as we get to them within the list of different point changes. Anyway, with that being said, let's dive into the different point changes for the Sisters of Battle, even if there aren't that many of them. To begin off, we'll start with HQ choices, and the HQ choice didn't see any changes, which is perfectly fine, as for the most part, the Sisters of Battle HQ choices are rather good and don't really need much help in the way of points. Though there are a couple that are a bit weaker than others, and those probably could have used a little bit of a buff, but at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world. And the same can be said about the troop choice, which also saw no changes, and once again the troop choice really didn't need much change, and can pretty much stay where it is, as it's perfectly fine and perfectly good. Even with the loss of Armor of Contempt, you're not particularly in a bad place with either the HQ or the troop choices. Where we see our first changes for the Sisters of Battle is within the elite unit type, and that changes that Repentia went up 2 points, going from 14 points to 16 points. That's a bit of a rough nerf, though at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world, as pretty much the majority of Adepta Sororitas lists did reduce their allocation of the Repentia down to about 10 to 20 models, as opposed to the original 30 that we used to see in the past. So while it's a bit of a points increase, it's not going to be something that's completely devastating, and with the removal of the compulsory troop choice within the Ark of Omens detachment type, you're all of a sudden able to find those points in other places, as you no longer have to bring quite as many troops, and you can opt to bring no troops at all, so it does make it a bit easier to find those points. In either case, I do think it's a little bit of a bummer, but the Repentia are still going to serve the role perfectly well, and they're going to be a rather good unit to include within lists going forward, even at their higher points cost, simply because they've always been a bit of a blunder unit that goes into an enemy, chops that enemy up, and then gets destroyed in return while being able to take down enemies that are worth more points than they are, or enemies that are critical to be taken out, and they're still perfectly fine for that role. There's one other unit that I want to mention, even though that unit didn't really see any changes, and that being the Paragon Warsuits. I do think, as a very durable unit, the Paragon Warsuits should have probably seen some love due to changes of Armor of Contempt being removed, as they really did benefit heavily from that specific rule. As such, I would have liked to have seen them see a bit of a points reduction, but that didn't happen, so I do think the Paragon Warsuits are definitely going to take a little bit of a backseat in comparison to how we've seen them within past lists, and that's a bit of a shame because they did offer a unique playstyle for the Sisters of Battle that was more durable in nature, focusing on more monstrous units than the typical style of play that the Adepta Sororitas are used to. And it's always sad to see diversity within list options going down in that sense, but there are some changes that do make up for it a little bit further down in the unit types, but I don't think the changes in those unit types are as big as losing Armor of Contempt on the Paragon Warsuits. Anyway, with that being said, let's move on to fast attack choices. The fast attack choice saw no changes, and it's going to continue being a very powerful choice for the Sisters of Battle, and it'll potentially replace the troop choice within the Ark of Omens detachment. And finally we come to the heavy support and transport changes for the Sisters of Battle, which are the last few changes for their different points costs. The first change that occurred is that the Exorcist tank went down from 130 points to 120 points, being a points reduction of 10 points total. I don't think this is particularly enough to make it see play, considering you have the option of the Castigator and many other units within the Sisters of Battle, so it would have been nice if they cut the points a little more aggressively, such that the Exorcist kind of came back into play, as it really did stop seeing play in comparison to where it was prior to the release of the 9th edition Sisters of Battle Codex. That being said, maybe you'll see a little more play, as it did still see some very fringe play within the 9th edition Codex rules, though it was very much a rarity. And as such, it would have been nice to see such a unique model be featured back on the tabletop as it was in the past. Now, a more relevant change, and one that kind of compensates for the Paragon Warsuits, is that the Mortifier engines have gone down by 5 points, going from 60 points to 55 points. This definitely gives you a little bit of a points reduction if you're still interested in playing that kind of monster style of list, but I do think it's not necessarily quite enough, though maybe we'll see mortifiers showing up in more lists within the Adepta Sororitas as a whole because they are a very pretty model and they do have a place within the game. However, they did take a bit of a backseat, and in the past we did see those Paragon warsuits showing up within different lists. However, now with the loss of Armor of Contempt and the points decrease on the mortifiers, maybe we'll see people swapping out those Paragons with mortifiers in the more generic style of lists, while in the more monster style of list, which features a heavy amount of mortifiers and Paragon warsuits, we might see this points decrease being enough to kind of keep those lists alive. In any case, I hope that's the case because I really like that monster style of play for the Sisters of Battle, and I think it's a very interesting twist on what's otherwise kind of a swarmy army. And with that being said, the final change that occurred was to a transport unit, being the Immolator tank. The Immolator went down by 10 points, going from 100 points to 90 points. That being said, the war gear still is rather expensive on the Immolator, and it would have been nice to see maybe a minor reduction in points for some of the war gear, especially the Twin Multi-Melta, as I think if they dropped it just a tiny bit, the Immolator would have been a lot more of an interesting inclusion. I do think the Immolator has potential of showing up within different lists, as it isn't the worst transport option for some of the smaller unit types, such as the Retributors, as it can give them a little bit more protection, while also serving as a bit of a gun platform itself. However, that being said, the problem is there's a lot of very heavy firepower within the current chapter approved, and things like Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights do hurt the inclusion of things like the Immolator, which while being decently armored, does not necessarily stand up to the incredible firepower that many armies include, and as such, I think that's what hurts it the most. So if they did reduce the points cost a little bit more than they did in this case, I think we would have seen more Immolators pop up within tournament play. That being said, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a few more Immolators pop up every now and then than we did in the past, but I don't think we're going to see a major influx of them within tournament play. In any case, that covers pretty much all of the changes for the Adepta Sororitas forces, and for the most part, I think the Adepta Sororitas are still going to be a pretty fine army, though they weren't necessarily dominant prior to this point. However, they did have a healthy amount of top 4 finishes. As such, I still think they're going to continue being represented within tournament play and still showing up within top 4s of different tournaments. I do think we're going to see a little bit less of them, as they did take more nerfs than they saw buffs. And that's a bit of a shame because they were already kind of a solid army that did kind of everything right, but wasn't oppressive within the meta, and maybe that's why they saw such minor changes. But I really think they should have taken more time to benefit some of the units that really lost out due to the Armor of Contempt changes. In any case, let me know what you think about the Sisters of Battle changes down below. Do you think they're going to continue being kind of a very solid army, or do you think they're going to fall in the rankings rather heavily as a result of these changes? And with that being said, we do conclude our coverage of the Sisters of Battle, and we can move on to the Necron forces. However, before we do so, I'd like to mention that I did open up a website that has a web store that sells brand new kits of Warhammer 40k models for a discount of what you would find them at the Games Workshop website. Do check out the link in the description down below, or visit venturetradeco.com. And also do remember that I only currently ship within the US, so unfortunately I can't ship to other countries. However, also if you're interested in other games such as Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, or many other collectible card games, I also carry many products for many other games, and I consistently add to the different product lines that I do offer on the website. So please do check it out, as it really does help the channel out and really does allow me to continue making this kind of content. In any case, with that being said, let's return back to coverage of the armies and continue covering the Necrons. The Necrons definitely saw a lot of changes going into the Ark of Omens chapter approved, and while some of the changes are definitely on the positive, I do think there are some very glaring negatives. Let's start with one of those big negatives, that being that the custom dynasty of Eternal Conquerors can no longer be taken alongside any secondary abilities like all other custom dynasties can. Now, while I do think something should have been done about the specific combination of Eternal Conquerors and Relentlessly Expansionist, as it was pretty much the dominant dynasty and kind of the only one that was seeing any kind of significant play, I do think this kind of change is a little bit too heavy-handed, and I do think it kind of destroys any ability for this custom dynasty to be taken, and pretty much feels like it's just been deleted from the game. The reason being is that the Neolak dynasty offers the same objective secured abilities, in addition to secondary bonuses, and it was already starting to see play within different lists. That being said, I think the way they should have probably handled it is either just keep it from being paired with Relentless Expansionist, as we've seen it being paired with other options in the past, or simply give it a short list of different secondaries that it can choose from, that way locking it into a little bit more of a balanced situation, where you can have a realistic option of taking that specific custom dynasty in addition to a secondary you might prefer more than what the Neolak dynasty offers. However, as it stands now, it's pretty much unplayable, and that's a bit unfortunate, as while it may increase diversity within different dynasty choices for the Necron forces, I don't like seeing things removed in such a heavy-handed way. In any case, I do think the Necrons will survive this change, but I do think it's a bit of a bummer. With that being said, let's move on to different points changes that the Necrons saw. The HQ choices for the Necrons, just like the Sisters of Battle, saw no changes in their points cost. In this case, I think there could have been some points reductions on some of the more expensive characters that don't see any play, or at the very least, a reduction in the points cost of the Entropic Lance on the Chronomancer, as that was one of those pieces of war gear that did see a points increase during the different chapter-approved changes, and it's one of those things that gave the Necrons a little bit more access to some anti-armor capabilities without necessarily being broken in itself. I do understand the Chronomancer is a very powerful unit, but at the end of the day, it would have been nice to kind of have that extra bit of a utility without changing how the Necrons play in any truly significant way, but I also understand why they might have not changed it as well. Anyway, with that being said, let's move on to troop choices for the Necron forces. The troop choices saw a single change, that being that the Necron warriors went down by 2 points per model, now being 11 points each instead of 13 points like they were previously. This is definitely a very good change, as the Necron warriors were definitely seeing less play due to all the different changes within the different chapter approveds that we saw come prior, and the Immortals have pretty much taken them out of the meta due to Immortals being a low cost option. I'm still not sure if the Necron warriors will see as much play as they did in the past, simply because of how the detachments are constructed within Arks of Omen, and you can pretty much forego including any troop choices. However, there's more reason to include them now than before, because the disappearance of Armor of Contempt does benefit the weapons of the Necron warriors, and does really make those Gauss Reapers a lot more attractive when combined in a large unit of Necron warriors with the ability to teleport them using a Veil of Darkness. In any case, I think the Necron warriors might see some resurgence as a result of these changes, which would be very nice, but I still don't think they're going to be the powerhouse that they once were, as the power of other armies within the game has definitely increased to the point where Necron warriors aren't quite as good as they once were. In any case, I think it's one that's going to be very beneficial, even if it doesn't change much in how you construct Necron lists, it does give you a lot more options than it did before. Moving on to elite choice, for the Necron forces, there have been 2 different changes, the first one being that the death marks went down 2 points like the Necron warriors did, going from 15 points to 13 points. And this is a decent enough change, but I don't think it's going to change much, as the death marks were already seeing a bit of play as a unit that can just take an objective or claim a board position and then provide some fire support for other units. I think if you're using them in that sense already, you're going to continue using them and you're going to be happy with the minor points reduction. That being said, I do think a lot of people overlook the benefits of death marks within different lists and their ability to kind of take positions while still contributing something to the game overall, because I think too many people view the death marks as just a sniper unit when they're more of a tactical unit, and when viewed as a unit that grabs an objective and then provides a little bit of fire support, they definitely become a lot more attractive than they would be as a sniper unit. In any case, let's move on to the next change for the elite of the Necron forces. The final change for the elites is that the Triarch Stalker went down 10 points, going down from 120 points to 110 points. You still have to pay for the war gear, which is definitely not the best place to be, considering how many other armies saw a major reduction in the war gear of their different units, in addition to points costs across the different units as well. That being said, I still think the Triarch Stalker is an alright fringe pick within certain Necron lists, but I don't think this change is really going to make you include it more, and I think they should have been a little more aggressive on the points cost of this model, maybe reducing some of the war gear, so that the Triarch Stalker saw a little bit more play than it did in the past. However, in any case, it's nice to see that they're kind of looking at some of these lesser played models and giving them a little bit of a boost here and there. Hopefully they continue doing it and they kind of dial in some of these rarer picks to be a little more common within different lists, but not necessarily ubiquitous across all different lists that Necrons build. And now we come to changes to the fast attack choice for the Necron forces. The first change we're going to cover is one that doesn't really make too much sense to me, being that Tomb Blades went down by 2 points per model, going from 20 points to 18 points a model. I really don't understand this change because the Tomb Blades were already seeing quite a lot of play as the previous chapter approved went on, so it's definitely kind of interesting to see such a popular unit go down in points when it was already incredibly powerful. Not only that, but the loss of Armor of Contempt definitely does make some of the weapon choices on the Tomb Blades all the more attractive, and I'm kind of surprised they did this because I would have thought maybe they would have focused on other units, and this does kind of show that maybe they're not quite as aware of the meta as they maybe should be in certain situations. Because if you looked at many of the previous Necron lists, you would have noticed that the Tomb Blades were seeing increasing amounts of play even at the higher points cost. So at the end of the day, this is definitely a nice change for the Necron players who enjoy their Tomb Blades, but I don't think it's necessarily one that's going to create more diversity within lists, and I don't think it's one that was necessarily needed to bring the Tomb Blades more into the spotlight when they were kind of already there and were doing perfectly fine. In any case, let's move on to the next change, which I think is a bit more of a needed one. that being that the Triarch Praetorians went down in points cost by 2 points, going from 22 points a model to 20 points a model. This is a nice step in the right direction, but I do think it's not enough, considering that the Triarch Praetorians were a little bit popular when the 9th edition Necron Codex first came out, but since then they've pretty much fallen out of the meta completely, and we haven't really seen them included with any list, so it's a little bit sad to see that they're still probably not going to be very much included, as the 2 points drop isn't quite enough to make them that attractive. That being said, maybe they'll see a little more play now, and maybe they'll see their day in the sun again, but I think they should have been a little more aggressive in this points change, as they're a bit of a unique unit that could have been really interesting to see a resurgence of. Anyway, with that being said, that covers all of the fast attack choices, and we can move on to heavy support changes. The heavy support changes saw all of one change, being that the Doomsday Ark went down 15 points, going from 160 points to 145 points. This definitely is a good change, and the Doomsday Ark just continues to become ever more interesting and seems to be the poster child of the heavy support for the Necron forces. I do think this is good because the Doomsday Ark has kind of fallen out of the meta a little bit, though it does see some occasional play every now and then. I definitely think this is a change that'll make it more aggressively costed and give people more reason to play it. However, I do think there's one thing that they overlook, and that being the Doomstalker. The Doomstalker hasn't really seen any points changes, while the Doomsday Ark continues to see massive points reduction within different editions of the chapter-approved series. I would have liked to have seen them reduce the Doomstalker as I mentioned in the past, as it's a very cool and unique model, but it just doesn't compare to the Doomsday Ark, especially at these reduced points costs. Maybe we'll see a change to the Doomstalker in future points adjustments, and that'll definitely be a good sign, because that's a unit that definitely could have used it in comparison to something like Tomb Blades, or even the Doomsday Ark, which is already pretty solid. Now moving on from the heavy support choices, we come to flyers which really didn't see much of a change, except for the universal rule that they now have to start within reserves. This doesn't necessarily hurt the flyers, but it does kind of change how you can play them, and it does reduce your capabilities of playing them in certain ways if you want to. This is kind of a big change, as we saw the Doomscythe being rather popular within various different lists because of its low points cost and its ability to kind of being a heavy hitting unit for the Necron forces. I do think we're going to see a drastic decline in the popularity of the Doomscythe, which is a little bit unfortunate as it does make that combat patrol a little bit less enticing, and the reason for that being is even though there are certain benefits to starting your flyer within reserves, it does force you to play it in a specific way, and being forced to play a model in a specific way can really reduce the functionality that you can get out of it within different games and makes it much harder to recoup the points that you put into it. I would like to see them kind of revert this rule and maybe make some changes that reduce the power of aircraft within the game without forcing you to play them in a very specific way. Either that or reduce the points cost on the different aircraft to make them more enticing even with this kind of change. And at times it does feel like they're not really sure where aircraft units fit within the game because it always feels like aircraft are either a bit unplayable or so good that they're kind of unavoidable. In any case, they keep changing the rules on them and maybe one day they'll get them right, so let's hope for that day to come sooner than later. Now finally we come to the most exciting changes for the different Necron forces, that being the Lord of War category, that kind of allows the Necrons to build Titanic lists and play a bit of a strategy as if they're playing Imperial Knights or something of that nature. The changes for this category have been actually rather impressive, and I do think we're going to start seeing a lot of these models popping up on the tabletop. The first of these changes is probably the most exciting one, being that the monolith has gone down 30 points baseline, going down from 300 points to 270 points. On top of that, the war gear, such as the death rays, has now become free on the monolith as well, considering the death rays are definitely something you would have wanted to take in most situations. In order to give the monolith that extra heavy hitting firepower, you all of a sudden save an additional 20 points across the 4 different death rays that you would have taken. This means that all of a sudden, the monolith has gone down a total of 50 points from its prior situation, and that makes it a really enticing and incredibly fun unit, considering how resilient and how powerful it can be. Not only that, but the Ark of Omens changes to the way detachments work definitely make it a much more enticing unit as well. And I think it was already on the cusp of playability in its prior incarnation, and now that it's all the more cheaper, I do think this is going to be a unit that's definitely going to be a major winner from the different changes within this chapter approved. And I do think you're going to start seeing it within a majority of the list, and not only because of the changes to it directly, but some of the other changes that we'll see within the Lords of War. The second change for the Lords of War is another one that I think is very interesting and very powerful. That being that Tesseract Bolt has gone down by 40 points, now being 360 points instead of a flat 400 points. And to think about it this way, the Tesseract Bolt has been anywhere between 1.5 and 2 Transcendent Catan shards, so it's already kind of very good considering that it was cheaper than 2 Transcendent Catan. it does have a little bit of vulnerability, but now that the points costs are even lower, and we've seen lists in the past that ran something like a Monolith, a Tesseract Vault, and the Silent King all in one list to kind of make a tightened list, I do think you're probably going to see the inclusion of more Tesseract Vaults because it changes to how detachments work within Ark of Omens, and as such, I think you're going to see a few more of them show up within different lists. Now there's one more points change within the Lords of War for the Necron forces. That one change being that the Obelisk is down 30 points, going from 300 to 270 points. I don't think this is really going to make it playable, as it's not a particularly good unit and it doesn't really have a place within Necron lists when compared to something like the Monolith or the Tesseract Vault or many other options that Necrons have access to. As such, I think the biggest changes are going to be the Monolith and the Tesseract Vault that you're probably going to be seeing a lot more within lists. And one final thing to consider is that while the Silent King hasn't been changed in itself, the change to how detachments are structured within the Ark of Omens does make it a little more awkward to include the Silent King within your list. I don't think it's the end of the world because the Zarkon Dynasty is still a perfectly fine inclusion, but in certain other situations, you might find it a little bit difficult to include him within one of your lists due to his dynasty limitations. In any case, I don't think that's the end of the world because you do have access to that much more powerful Monolith, and as we recently covered on this channel, there are opportunities to build a list that does not include the Silent King and still be rather successful with the forces of the Necrons. And with all that being said, I think it's time to wrap up the Necrons. The Necrons are definitely a powerful army, even with some of the different changes that they saw going into this chapter approved. I do think they've definitely seen some massive buffs in the form of the Monolith being so much cheaper now, and I think it's going to be something that you're going to see much more often, as well as some of the other units maybe making a little bit more of an appearance due to some of the points changes. Though that being said, I think the Necrons are going to continue being a very powerful force, and I think they're going to be at the top of the middle tier armies, or even in a top tier army position, depending on how much the loss of that Eternal Conqueror's dynasty affects them in the long run. I don't think it's going to affect them that much, and I think they're still going to be kind of a top tier army, in that they have a lot of different ways of building lists, and being very competitive at various different levels, not that they're necessarily broken. In any case, let me know what you think in the comments down below of the different Necron changes and of the different Adepta Sororitas changes. Do you agree with me or disagree with me, and which ones are you most excited for, and which ones do you think they kind of missed out on? As always, thank you for watching, and do remember check out VentureTradeCo.com if you're interested in buying 40k models or other different collectible and hobby items within the United States, as it really does help the channel out. And don't forget to like and subscribe for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day. See you next time. Bye.